Greetings and welcome to Informal Logic, Argument as Reasoned Dialogue. Well, that said, welcome everyone, and let's get right down to the presentation here. So we're going to go over a bit of an introductory to informal logic. We're going to start with argument as reasoned dialogue. So we'll be going over dialogue, reasoning, and logic. So sit back and let's get into it. So the introduction here is why even study logic? There is an art of reasoned dialogue. Logic teaches us to critically evaluate arguments in everyday life. And what are arguments? Arguments are the purpose of arguments, we could say, is being that not all ideas are equal. Argument helps us determine which ones are better than others. So logic teaches us to critically evaluate arguments. Evaluate what kind of value are we getting from these arguments, these comparisons of ideas in everyday life. Context matters. Arguments exist in dialogue, not in isolation. So there's a dynamic involved with the whole context of logic. The goal is to distinguish strong reasoning from weak. And here's an example. There's arguments in politics, law, or science always depend on commitments shared in dialogue. So that said, let's get started. Let's look at the dialogue in context. A dialogue is a sequence of exchanges with goals. Cooperation is required for a dialogue. Breaking it causes poor arguments. Understanding context is essential for meaningful dialogue. You both want to be on that same level of transaction and abstraction. So here's an example. I have a 14-year-old son. That's A. B says, well, that's all right. A says, I also have a dog. And B says, oh, I'm sorry. Now, without context, it seems bizarre, but the context of this conversation is about an apartment rental. So with the context, now it makes sense. Sure, children are allowed, but animals and pets aren't. So when this conversation, this dialogue begins with A saying, I have a 14-year-old son, and B says, well, that's all right. A then says, I also have a dog, and B says, oh, I'm sorry. So as we can see, context makes sense of the dialogue. Now let's look at some types of dialogue. There is the infamous quarrel. It's driven by anger, attack, and emotional appeals. The aim is to hit opponent at all costs. Hopefully not with that gavel. It leads to regret and logical collapse. Some examples here, we have ad hominem attacks, emotional reasoning and emotional appeals, but no logical progress. An example here is that personal quarrels show ad hominem attacks dominate, proving nothing. You're just saying that because you're too stupid to understand the real issues. This type of exchange, so once again, here's a personal quarrel here. The quotation is, you're just saying that because you're too stupid to understand the real issues. This type of exchange attacks the person, not the argument. It relies on emotional manipulation. It prevents meaningful resolution. And it has a potential of damaging relationships. So quarrels best to be avoided. But then we have another type of dialogue. Remember, there's a commitment and there's a certain agreement. And this is a debate. We have a more structured format than quarrels. Judges or audiences may decide. The rules limit, but may still allow fallacies. So think about this. In some debates, there are some fallacies that are allowed, but they may be limited also by the rules. Success is the persuasion of audience, not the truth. So there's a lot of rhetoric involved in debate. There's a formal structure, there's a competitive nature, and it's audience focused. It's not focused on the truth, it's focused on persuading an audience. An example here is a debater may use aggressive questioning, effective in scoring points, but logically irrelevant. The quotation here from the debater would be, "Wouldn't you agree that your position would lead to disastrous consequences for our economy?" This technique creates emotional impact on the audience. It shifts the focus from logical reasoning. It may score points, though, in the debate format because there is a formal structure, but it does not contribute to truth-seeking. Another type of dialogue is the persuasion or the critical discussion. Each side has a thesis to prove using opponents' commitments. So we've all agreed to have a dialogue based on this persuasive argument. Aim, resolution of issue, not a mere victory. So the subject here is an issue, and the goal is the resolution of the issue, not a mere victory, not persuading an audience, not even necessarily seeking just the truth, but a resolution of an issue. It focuses on logical reasoning and shared understanding. So this is the main focus. We have, of course, logical reasoning, but there is a shared understanding. So the persuasion, it requires a tad bit of consent on both sides. There's a symmetrical burden of proof. Each side must try to prove something against the other side. There's a truth-seeking orientation and mutual respect for arguments. So although there is a truth-seeking orientation, ultimately it comes down to a burden of proof. And both sides have their own burden of proof. So you could say there's a symmetrical dialogue going on here because each one is trying to do the same thing to meet their burden of proof. Then there's, of course, mutual respect for the arguments. So here we have Bob saying, "Tipping is good because it rewards excellence of service. Therefore, tipping should be maintained." But then Helen says, "Workers should get regular pay reflecting their worth. Therefore, tipping should not be maintained." The application. Both argue opposite theses, so there's symmetrical persuasions. So Bob is saying his thesis here is that tipping rewards excellent services, so it should be maintained. But then Helen, her thesis is that workers should get the pay reflecting their worth. So they each have their own thesis to prove, and whoever can prove it best to the other, remember there's that shared understanding, will have the persuasive win. Now there's other dialogue types too. And before we do that, let's jump over here to the chat. We have Bill Thomas says, "I thought auctioneers and horse race announcers spoke quickly, and then I helped with the college debate." Yeah, that's depends on the situation there. All right, so we have other dialogue types. There's inquiry, fact-finding. Example given here is the air crash investigation. There's a certain dialogue, so the questioning, the interrogation, the inquiry. Then we have negotiation, another dialogue. This is about bargaining. It's an interest-based conflict. So it's interest-based. Each one has their own particular interest. That's where the conflict or the need for resolution exists. It's done through bargaining. This is the negotiation. Then there's the information seeking. It's another dialogue. One asks, one answers. Then there's a deliberation, deciding best course of action. Then we have the heuristic, the verbal fight, revealing conflict basis. So we have divorce dispute may shift from negotiation, a custody fight, to persuasion, who is best for the children. Dialogue types can evolve as the context and goals of the conversation change. So you can see a dynamic flow from different types of dialogues within a conversation. Now we're at the opening stage of the dialogue. First, we got to identify the type of dialogue, the agenda, and rules. So there's some types of dialogues, it might be explicit, as in a trial, versus implicit, just a conversation. So here, an explicit example here is formal rules will have a clear structure and codified procedures. So the explicit type of dialogue here is going to have established rules and structure. Now the implicit dialogue relies on social norms. There'll be contextual cues depending on the parties in the dialogue. If one person has a particular demeanor, then that means it's going to set the standard for the dialogue. And then, of course, there's the unspoken expectations. So when you're in certain situations, you're supposed to know what's expected. It won't be codified. So in court, rules are codified. In casual dialogue, politeness governs. The opening stage establishes the framework for meaningful dialogue. It defines the boundaries of discussion, whether they're the formal rules or the unspoken expectations. It sets the expectations for participants. It establishes criteria for evaluation, part of that agreement, and determines appropriate communication methods. So moving along here. Then we get to the argumentation stage. Parties argue, criticize, and defend positions. They must fulfill obligations, allow opponent the same chance. So it must be a balance. Equal opportunity to respond, both meet burdens of proof and avoid evasion tactics. So turn taking prevents evasion and ensures fairness. In formal debates and discussions, each participant gets equal time. Direct responses are required. Interruptions are limited or prohibited, and rebuttals must address specific points. So as we can see here, in a formal debate and discussion, because of rules, each participant gets equal time. There's no need for interruptions. They're either limited or all out prohibited. The structure maintains logical rigor and prevents dominance by a single voice. So it's all part of the fairness in the argumentation stage for the argument to have validity. Then we get to the closing stage. The dialogue ends when goal is achieved or mutually agreed. An improper exit is unfair. Closure must be genuine. So you don't make an improper exit at the closing stage because that's just unfair. Everyone started with an agreement. It must be closed with the same mutual agreement. And that happens with the completion of objectives as well. And of course, a fair conclusion, getting back to the equal time, etc. Ending debate early because one side is losing is a violation. Proper closure requires allowing all parties to present their case, reaching natural conclusion points, following established procedures, and maintaining respect for all participants. Premature termination undermines the entire dialogue process and its purpose. So you finish what you started. Now we get to persuasion. Persuasion is you have an asymmetrical burden of proof in persuasion because only one party makes a positive claim, the other only questions. So this is an asymmetrical example in persuasion. So an asymmetrical burden of proof in persuasion, one party makes a positive claim, the other questions. So only one side is questioning. The positive burden must prove thesis, will provide the evidence and construct arguments. If it's a negative burden, will only raise doubts, question evidence, and point out weaknesses. So here's an example. Carl, he's a believer in God, argues for existence. Eric is agnostic, raises doubts. The application here is Carl carries positive burden of proof. Eric only has a duty to question, so it's asymmetrical. Now we're on to persuasion with a symmetrical example with equal burden of proof in symmetrical persuasion. Both parties make opposing claims requiring evidence. So it's not one presenting evidence or one questioning. Both parties will be presenting evidence. Symmetrical structure. There's an equal burden of proof, direct opposition, and mutually exclusive claims. The dispute resolution happens by comparing evidence, evaluating arguments, determining which is stronger position, and that's the winner. So it's really by, in the symmetrical example, you can have a direct comparison like this. So you can compare, evaluate, and determine. Here we have another example with Mary, who's an atheist, argues God does not exist. And we have Barbara, a believer, argues God does exist. The application here is both carry equal burden of proof. Direct opposition is a dispute. So you can see here the difference between the believer and the atheist, and what we have here, the believer and the agnostic. Asymmetrical versus the symmetrical. And here we have persuasion with a burden of proof. There's positive burden, which must prove the thesis, and negative burden, only resist or question. So here's the dispute. You have strong opposition, direct contradiction, and equal burden of proof. And then we have a dissent, weak opposition, raising doubts, unequal burden of proof. So for an example, we have in the Carl-Eric dialogue, Carl has proof burden, must prove God exists. Eric has lighter burden, only needs to raise doubts. Here, beyond reasonable doubt, and other phrases like that. That comes into this burden of proof. This asymmetrical structure reflects how burden of proof works in many real-world dialogues. So let's look at some of these. We have person making claim bears the burden of proof. So we see how we have here, must prove his thesis as a positive burden. The person making a claim bears the burden of proof. The skeptic only needs to identify weaknesses, though. And default position remains until proven otherwise. And I think that's a continuance of conditions, is what that would be considered in evidence. So the default position remains until proven otherwise. Let's continue here. Then we have the deductive argument, the strictest standard. The premises guarantee conclusion. There's a logical necessity, necessary connection between premises and conclusion. There's a valid structure. The form matters more than content in a deductive argument. There are no exceptions. If premise is true, conclusion cannot be false. So here, for an example, we have every person who does a good job should get regular pay. Alex is a person who does a good job. Therefore, Alice should get regular pay. If premises are true, conclusion cannot be false. So very straightforward. It's a strictest standard. If premise is true, conclusion cannot be false. And that's our deductive argument. And we're on to the inductive and plausible arguments. The inductive argument here is most people who do a good job should get regular pay. Alice does a good job. Therefore, Alice should get regular pay. The plausible here, well, this is strong but certain, and is based on probability and patterns. Alice should get regular pay. As we see here, Alice, the person does a good job, Alice should get regular pay. Alice does a good job, therefore Alice should get regular pay. In this one here, as we see, strong but certain, it's based on probability and patterns when we do it to this. And the plausibility here is it is widely accepted that people who do a good job should get regular pay. Alice does a good job, therefore Alice should get regular pay. So this shifts the burden of proof. It's widely accepted that people who do a good job should get regular pay. It's based on accepted opinion. It's widely accepted. Here it's strong but certain. Most people. And of course in the direct deductive argument, every person who does a good job. So every person, most people, it's widely accepted. That goes from deductive argument, strictest standard, with logical necessity, no exceptions, to the inductive, strong but certain, based on probability and patterns, and the plausible argument shifts the burden of proof and is based on accepted opinion. So it's widely accepted. Now, burden of proof gets shifted. Well, no, it's not widely accepted. You see? Most people, well, that's not all people. It's strong but not certain. But when we say every person, it's certain. Conclusion cannot be false. Let's check over here to the chat. Bill Thomas says, for where'd it go? Uh-oh. Very strange. It's not working there. Give me 1 second. Wonder what happened here. Oh boy. All right, that's broken. Give me a second here. We're going to fix that. There's more than one way to skin a cat. See if that's very strange. One more minute. We can't let that slide. I don't know what happened here, but we're going to find out. Breakdown logic. Wow, this is really strange. Indeed. Okay, hang on a second. I think we might have gotten to the bottom of it. Not yet. Throw another comment up there and let me see if this is, we got this one here refreshed. Because this should be bringing our comments back. Let's see, chat, there we go. I see a chat in there. It's not coming up for some reason. That's really strange. One more try here, and just do one more thing. Let's see if we can get it going. Oh wow, I just did the wrong one. That's all right. All right, well, oh, there we go. Whoa, there we go. All right, it's back. No, it wasn't too long. It just takes time. A little breakdown logic. You can't let technology whoop us. You know, this is technology is supposed to serve us. All right, there we go. All right, let's get back to where we left off. Thanks for sticking with me on that one. All right, I think this is where we left off here. Negative rules, yes indeed. All right, negative rules, opening and confrontation. And I think I neglected to read the chat that we were supposed to read here. For standards of proof, I know of preponderance of evidence, clear and convincing, and beyond reasonable doubt. I'm not sure what others exist. There are quite a few other standards of proof. We went over a whole bunch of these on a different live stream. You mentioned a bunch of them. Let's see, clear and convincing. Yeah, there's another one. Preponderance. Well, if anyone else thinks, throw them in the chat. We'll put them up there. Let's get back to the negative rules. Opening and confrontation. No unlicensed shifts. There's no unlicensed shifts between dialogue types. So as we said before, they might flow between different dialogue types, It's done in agreement. There's no unlicensed shifts and no manipulation. There's no manipulation or refusal of the agenda. Agreed on an agenda, you stick to it. There's established common ground. There's clear agreement on issue and rules and the level of formality. So without agreement on the issue, fair persuasion cannot begin. When parties cannot agree on the topic of discussion, the type of dialogue, the rules of engagement, the dialogue becomes unproductive and potentially unfair. There's negative rules with the argumentation. Here's part one of this. We have, again, the burden of proof, must meet burden of proof. There's also burden shifting. We cannot illicitly shift burden to the opponent. And commitment-based, must use opponent's commitments, not outside assumptions. So remember, we started with commitments and agreements. Cannot shift these, make unlicensed moves, and you must use the opponent's commitments, not outside assumptions. So using irrelevant premises undermines persuasion. When arguing, stay focused on the actual issue. Use only relevant evidence. Address opponent's actual position and avoid introducing unrelated topics. We see this a lot as diversionary tactics. So it's very important when arguing that you stay focused on the actual issue, sometimes the material issue. Use only relevant evidence, things that apply to the central issue, or directly or indirectly. Address opponent's actual position. Don't misconstrue your opponent's position and then start arguing that. And avoid introducing unrelated topics, no distractions. Irrelevant arguments distract from the core issue and violate the principles of fair dialogue. Bill Thomas says, I'm not sure if reasonable suspicion and probable cause count as standards of proof or not. Not necessarily for standards of proof, but maybe, suspicion, probable cause. Probable cause might be closer to that. Not too sure about the reasonable suspicion. I don't think that's even a term. That's some made up thing they've come up with. What's reasonable suspicion to one is not necessarily reasonable suspicion to another. Some people are just paranoid. Then every suspicion to them is reasonable. But I digress. Let's get to the negative rules with argumentation here. We got to stay relevant. Answer the right question. Appropriate questions, though. Ask appropriate questions. And, of course, reply honestly. And define the terms. Define terms clearly when challenged. So, again, it's all about how the word is being used and in what context, so we're defining it correctly for the context. So, a prosecutor argues, murder is horrible, instead of proving the defendant guilty. So that is irrelevant. This violates argumentation rules because it fails to address the actual question. It introduces emotionally charged but irrelevant information. It attempts to sway opinion without evidence. And it shifts focus away from burden of proof. See, these are little diversionary tactics to shift attention away and focus away from the burden of proof. Effective argumentation requires staying focused on the specific issue at hand. Good advice on that one. Some more negative rules, the closing stage. No premature closure, as we said. Cannot force closure prematurely. It all begins with a mutual agreement, though. It must close by mutual agreement or completion of objectives. And a fair conclusion. All parties must have equal opportunity to present their case. So, again, no premature closure. It has to be a fair closure, a fair conclusion, and the mutual agreement. It began with the mutual agreement. It must close by mutual agreement. So ending dialogue because one side is losing violates fairness. Proper closure requires allowing all parties to complete. We read this one, didn't we? Reaching natural conclusion points, following established procedures, and maintaining respect for all participants. Premature termination undermines the entire dialogue process and its purpose. That might be a little redundant there, but important points. Now we're on to fallacies, the complex question. So, definition here is presupposes commitment in answer. So this is the complex question. It presupposes a commitment in the answer. It creates a logical trap. It limits possible responses. And it also assumes unproven facts. That's our presupposition here. It's assuming unproven facts. So here's an example. Have you stopped abusing your spouse? Any answer presumes past abuse. If you answer yes, you admit to past abuse. If you answer no, you admit to current abuse. The application here is it unfairly traps opponent and it violates the rules. Complex question. Objection. Audit them. Yes, sounds about right. Exactly. And we have St. Frog Dog says probable cause must be proven with evidence, so it is in itself cannot be a standard. True, and I think that what we know from probable cause is that it's something that's either by oath or affirmation, right? So except for a breach of a peace committed in someone's presence or when they have reasonable ground to believe that a person is committing a crime, about to commit a crime, or just created or whatever, I guess would really be is committing a crime or about to commit a crime, then that would be the probable cause for any kind of a criminal action, and that's usually where that's used. But it wouldn't be a burden of proof standard, I don't believe. I was stretching there to try to see if either of those would fit, but they don't. So thanks for that, St. Frog Dog. That is correct. So we're into the, there we go. The fallacy. Ignoratio elenchi. So the definition is it proves irrelevant conclusion. It misses the actual point and it redirects to different issue. It avoids addressing the real issue. So we have, it's ignoring the real issue. It proves irrelevant conclusion. So here we go. Here's an example. Murder is a horrible crime. The real issue is whether the defendant committed murder. The prosecutor's statement is emotionally compelling. It states an obvious truth, yet it fails to address the defendant's guilt. The application here is it may be persuasive, but irrelevant to case. We see this a lot too. All right, we're on to the fallacy of emotional appeals. Second here. There we go. Get back here. So we have a fallacy of emotional appeals. The ad baculum, which is the appeal to force. The ad misericordiam, the appeal to pity. I guess this misery here. And ad populum, the appeal to enthusiasm or crowds. So another very common one right there we see a lot of. An example here, crowd-rousing slogans may excite, but they don't prove the claim. And let's see here, the emotional appeals manipulate feelings rather than reason. They substitute emotion for evidence. They appeal to prejudice or bias. They create false sense of urgency. And the problem here is emotional responses do not equal logical proof. Yeah, we had some good points there in the last one. I think that was when your chat came up there. So again, we have the appeal to force, the appeal to pity, and the appeal to enthusiasm or crowds. but they're just too powerful. All right. Then we get to everyone's favorite fallacy, the ad hominem. Definition is it's the one that attacks the person, not the argument. So it's against the person, not the argument. It ignores the actual argument. It focuses on personal characteristics. And it diverts from logical evaluation. So some examples here. Einstein's theories are ravings of a liberal mind. That came from Mr. Nazi Scientist. Relativity is fascist propaganda. That came from a Soviet writer. I'm not sure these are real life examples. These are, just little novelties here for this presentation. The application here is irrelevant to scientific validity. Personal attacks don't address the merits of scientific theories or arguments. Now we're on to the fallacy of authority and causation. So the ad verecundium, misuse of authority to silence dissent. Where have we seen this one before? Now we have a name for it. The ad verecundium. Then we have the post hoc fallacy, the false causal inference. So the post hoc, it means after the cause here. So we have correlation does not imply causation, and authority does not replace evidence. So the correlation does not replace the causation. And the misuse of authority to silence dissent. Authority does not replace evidence. So here's an example. This looks like a post hoc here. Storks correlated with birth rates is falsely inferred causation. Storks. This classic example shows statistical correlation between stork populations and human birth rates. There's a false conclusion that storks deliver babies. The actual cause. Rural areas have both more storks and higher birth rates. The application here is statistical correlation does not equal causation. So statistical correlation, correlating these facts, does not equal causation. It's not the cause of them. So that's your post hoc false causal inference. And of course, the misuse of authority to silence dissent we're pretty familiar with, the ad verecundium. But he's a doctor. All right, fallacy. Equivocation. Definition is the meaning of terms shift mid-argument. So the same word now has different meanings. It creates false logical connections and relies on semantic ambiguity. Here's some examples. All elephants are animals. Henry is a small elephant. Therefore, Henry is a small animal. In the context of elephants, small. In the context of animals, small. So the application here is small elephant equals smaller than other elephants. Small animal equals smaller than most animals. Henry could be large compared to other animals. See? Henry is a small elephant. All elephants are animals. See how we're kind of shifting the same word meaning different things. Henry is now a small animal because elephants are animals. But Henry's an elephant. So Henry being a small animal doesn't mean that being a small elephant doesn't mean he's necessarily a small animal. So you see how this works here? It's easy to confuse people with this. So the application here, small elephant, smaller than other elephants. Small animal, smaller than most animals. So Henry could be large, right, compared to other animals. Nowhere do we say he was a small animal, making this conclusion from two statements here that couldn't possibly lead to it logically. As we see here, he could be large, and we know he is compared to other animals. Right, now we're on to the straw man fallacy, another great one. Core example here. Definition: misrepresent the opponent's position to refute easily. So it creates a distorted version of the argument. It avoids addressing the actual position. Instead, it attacks a weaker, misrepresented claim. Here's an example. C says, ban alcohol ads. They encourage teenage drinking. A says, you cannot get people to give up drinking. See, application here. A distorts C's argument. It's easier to attack, right? You cannot get people to give up drinking, right? But the argument was to ban alcohol ads because they encourage teenage drinking. So again, this is a straw man. He didn't say about getting people to give up drinking. He talking about encouraging teenage drinking. The distortion occurs because C wants to ban advertising, not drinking. A misrepresents this as wanting to ban drinking. A then attacks the misrepresented position. You see how that works with a straw man fallacy. Very quick. The distorted version of an argument that makes it easier to attack. So here's an immediate example of the straw man fallacy. In a media context, political statements often distorted for sensationalism. Often, oh boy, I'll tell you. There's subtle wording changes. Yeah, minor alterations can significantly alter meaning. Then there's the media amplification. Distorted versions spread faster than corrections. Ooh, that's very certain there. And public perception. Misrepresentation damages credibility long term. So again, the thing about distorted versions, they spread faster than the corrections. So the misrepresentation damages credibility long term. So from Al Gore, his original statement from the algorithm, he said, I took the initiative in creating the internet. But somehow the media distortion changed it to, I invented the internet. So the application here is the original, taking initiative in legislative support. The distortion was claiming personal invention. The impact was it became a political punchline despite the factual basis. Again, we all get played by that straw man fallacy in the media every single day. Now we're on to the argument from consequences. Negative consequences. Cites bad outcomes to oppose change. Runs on fear appeal. Uses emotional response to maintain status quo. It's a one-sided analysis. It ignores potential benefits of change. Example here is, if tipping ends, unemployment will result. Unemployment is bad. Therefore, tipping should not end. So we see this a lot too, jumping to conclusions, right? So it predicts a negative outcome of a policy change. It appeals to fear of unemployment, but it may ignore other factors affecting employment. Let's move along here. And there's the argument from consequences, the positive one. The positive consequences. It cites good outcomes to support change. It runs on hope appeal, uses desires for improvement to promote change. Remember that hope and change? Works well. One-sided analysis, again, ignores potential drawbacks of change. Example, if tipping ends, service providers will gain self-esteem. Self-esteem is good. Therefore, tipping should end. The application here is it predicts a positive outcome of a policy change. It appeals to desire for self-esteem, but it may ignore other factors affecting service providers, like getting paid. Now we're on to the argument from consequences in political case here. The negative consequence. Separation would harm Quebec's economy. The positive consequence. Separation would preserve French culture. So here's Quebec wants to separate to preserve their French culture, but in doing so, it would harm their economy. So we have two sides here. We have competing values, economic stability versus cultural preservation. Now we have to weigh the consequences. Difficulty comparing disparate types of outcomes. This is not a direct comparison. Then you have the emotional fear, the emotional factor, the role of emotion in evaluating potential outcomes. This case demonstrates that different values lead to different conclusions, that difficulty weighing disparate types of consequences, and the role of emotion in evaluating potential outcomes. So we can see here when you're weighing those consequences, you end up with these different emotional and different value components to it that make it a little bit more difficult to get to a resolution. Okay, and we're on to the power of reasoned dialogue. So with reasoned dialogue that we've gone over here tonight, we've learned about building bridges. Logic is not only about spotting fallacies, it's about building bridges of understanding. It requires deep listening. Every dialogue offers a chance to persuade fairly, to listen deeply, and to resolve conflict with integrity. There's the power of truth. Fallacies remind us how easily we can be misled, but also show the powerful truth, how powerful truth becomes when argued with clarity. So the fallacies remind us how easily we can be misled, but also how powerful truth becomes when argued with clarity. So we want to argue truth with clarity, and it becomes very powerful. Then we have the tools of the dialogue that we learned here. When you enter a dialogue, you carry the tools of fairness, reason, and respect. So the call to reason dialogue: argue, not to defeat, but to illuminate, not to silence, but to understand. Logic as the art of seeking justice, truth, and shared wisdom. And let's see here, where are we? Indeed, that takes us to the end of the presentation here of informal logic. So I hope everyone learned a little something here. If not, it was a good refresher for any of the logic you had before, or if you never had and just learned on your own. But indeed, it's something that reason dialogue benefits everybody in a civilized culture so that people can live with easy resolution. Let's see what you have here. Begging the question, circular reasoning, belonging fallacies. Yeah, there's quite a few more fallacies. We just went over a few of them that apply directly into the informal logic. No, those are all fallacies indeed. So we could go on and on with that. Again, these are the most prominent ones that you'll find in your common arguments. And I just wanted to have as just a introductory to this for a lot of people that were unfamiliar with some of the formalities of informal logic and argument as reasoned dialogue, not as quarreling, not as a battle, but as a way to find truth and to achieve resolution when there are disputes. So again, this is the way that a higher form of thinking and people that are more concerned with fairness would operate. A good serving of fallacies, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I think we had enough fallacies for the night here. The key point was to focus on the logic and the applications of it when it comes into arguments, both formal and informal types of arguments, structured and the implied type. So with that said, I hope everyone had a little bit of fun here tonight. I'm sure we're going to get into more aspects of logic as time goes on, but this was a good primer here, I think. And if we all like it, then I think it'd be good to hit a thumbs up so we know that it's liked and we'll come up with more content like this. And with that said, I thank you all for coming here, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace out.